Today. I hope they're all here. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Charles Mok from the founding chair of the Internet Society of Hong Kong. Welcome.
Thank you.
Edmund Hoy, Senior Solutions Principal from EMC Consulting, APJ. Welcome, Edmund. Lee Field, Principal Consultant, Global Services, Verizon Enterprise Solutions. Thank you, Lee. Nicholas Blackmore, Registered Foreign Lawyer with Kennedy's. Terry Cheung, Vice Chairman, CSA Hong Kong and Macau and General Manager IT Infrastructure in CTM. China, what's CTM? Something Telecom Macau. Yeah. And Tim Grance, Senior Computer Scientist, NIST US. Tim, welcome back. The panel we have for you, have a seat, gentlemen. Good.
If we can
Get on your chairs.
get on stay balanced.
Now, the panel here is very deliberate. We haven't picked all these gentlemen for their good looks, charm and personality.
Really?
Sorry. What we've got is we've got Charles and representing the user side of the perspective. We've got Edmund and Lee representing the cloud vendor perspective. We've got Nicholas representing the legal perspective. We've got Terry representing Macau and everything Macau is good for. And we've got Tim representing the government perspective. So we do...
No, not the whole government.
Oh, not the whole government, just the whole US government. The questions, hopefully we've got a good variety here, and don't be shy to ask your questions. The box of questions was actually empty, I think. So I don't think anyone actually wrote down a question, which makes my job more challenging up here. So what I want to do, the theme that we're doing is obviously building trust in cloud computing, but what we're doing here at the panel is what are the key success factors. So by way of getting started, I just want to quickly run left to right and just, a quick one minute or so, just introduce a couple of key success factors that you think is very important for cloud computing. So we'll start with you, Charles.
Thank you. When I think about cloud computing, actually, whether I'm trying to talk from the user's perspective, or if I'm trying to talk from the even sometimes from the service provider's perspective, I think the biggest problem that we still see today, I think some of the speakers today alluded to this fact, is that there seems to be a lack of definition, or there seems to be a lack of common acceptance of what definition cloud really means. And at least from the Hong Kong's perspective, my feeling is that you either have a lot of people that would think, okay, great, cloud, I'm using my apps and on my iPhone and my Gmail and so on. So that's cloud. I'm already using it. Or you see the other kind of people that are totally just thinking about, okay, cloud, that means just infrastructure. That means my data center, because people tend to think about or look at things that are tangible. And then what's in between? I mean, between the applications and between the core infrastructure, everything in between, when we talk about platform, IaaS, PaaS, and so on, there seems to be a very much of a lack of awareness or focus in that area, because understandably, that probably is the more difficult part to understand or define. And most people, all they know is VMware, and beyond that, I mean, everything in that middle layer, people just find it very vague, and I find that to be a big problem when we really want to talk to people about cloud and try to talk in the same wavelength. A lot of times, people are perceiving it in very different ways, and then naturally, they come back and say that security is their biggest concern. I mean, in what area would you want to discuss that security isn't the biggest concern? It's always like that. I mean, 10, 20 years ago, when we first started talking about e-commerce, people say security is the biggest concern, but I always object to that. I think price is the biggest concern. If it's cheap enough, you're willing to take the risk. So there's a lot of security is always the easiest thing to blame on, or use as an excuse not to adopt. And I'm finding it, at least up to now, that this seems to be what is happening when we talk about cloud computing or cloud security.
Good. Yeah, risk management isn't really a topic that many people have discussed throughout today. It's been more security, privacy, but the balance of risk and security hasn't really been a theme. Edmund, you want a couple of points on?
Well, actually, as a vendor, that we encounter many requests from our customer that they will hit some challenge of what kind of application are they going to put into the public cloud or private cloud or even not going to cloud. So in that case, we need to strike a balance between what you have mentioned, security and the business agility. So normally we would go into detail by understanding the business requirement, definitely the first step. And the next one is by understanding the functionality, economic area of the application, what they are serving, and we definitely would finally consider the trust in terms of governance, risk management, and compliance, and also what we call CIA in terms of information security.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Lee, you want to follow on with that one?
Yeah, and I guess my take on it is very similar, but again, somewhat different. At Verizon, we've been pretty fortunate in that we've actually had an infrastructure as a service platform in Hong Kong for nearly 2 years, where we've had some of our bigger successes is assisting our clients in not just moving to the cloud, but how they can drive business agility and flexibility, and also important price points by looking at how we can deliver application migrations. How do we move your core business application in, and importantly, how do we ensure you can move it out? And that's really a lot of what we've been doing for the last 12 months. Not just positioning cloud as a product, as a platform to drive those business needs, but helping our clients analyze, understand their applications much more so than purely physical to virtual migrations. How do we look at driving application migration? And if we're successful in that, we hit all of those key requirements.
I'm sort of getting a bit of a key theme, from defining initial standards and everything, and what Edmund and you're both saying is one of education, awareness, training, hand-holding to bring people into the environment. Very important. Nicholas, what about from a legal perspective?
From a legal perspective, I guess the big issue that I'd say would be a success factor in cloud computing is the management of data, and obviously probably everyone's been talking about this all day, but the difficult legal issues to get right are the same things that I think your customers are worried about, and that is if your customers are individuals, then privacy is going to be a huge issue. At the moment, privacy is a huge concern thanks to the octopus debacle of a couple of years ago, and that leads into the amendments to the privacy ordinance, which are being considered now. So the landscape is changing, and everyone's more concerned about privacy in Hong Kong and indeed around the world than they have been in a long time. So getting privacy right is a key success factor for any cloud computing business, and it applies in the commercial context as well, even if you're not handling data of individuals, if you're just handling data of corporate clients. How you manage that data, whether your corporate clients are sort of secure in the knowledge that they can get access to their data when they need it, what happens if their contract ends, what happens if you go insolvent. That's a lot of the concerns that corporate clients have are around that sort of data management and data security as well. So they're the sort of legal issues that are hard ones to get right. So that's why I think they're probably the success factors for a cloud computing provider.
Yeah, good. You raise a key point, and it sort of builds on the trust theme that was coming on as well in terms of what happens when there is a big incident, a bad apple in one corner of the sector. It basically shakes up the whole sector, or cloud computing itself. We've seen examples of cloud service providers being out and business models coming to a standstill while the cloud service provider brings back up. So it raises a good point when you introduce.
And increasingly, your privacy policy used to just be a document that sat on your website and probably no one looked at. And now you see social networking sites and cloud computing providers getting a lot more scrutiny of their privacy practices. So when Google changed its privacy policy a couple of months ago, it had to do so with a big PR campaign that explained to everyone what they were changing, because everyone's really keeping their eye on the likes of Google and Facebook and Microsoft as to how they're handling people's personal information.
Good. Terry?
Hi. I'm responsible for the internal IT infrastructure. So I need to provide basic computing services to internal, as well as I'm also responsible for the development of our upcoming cloud services. So for the internal world, okay, we are also looking for external cloud services, cost-effective cloud services. So, but how can we trust those external cloud service provider? I think it's a bit difficult, isn't it? So for developing of our internal cloud services, what sort of security we can base on? Okay, even we are building a very comprehensive cloud protection on top of our cloud service. Can we value it, sell it as value-added services on top of our the cloud services? I think it's difficult. So what I think, in order for a greater or global perspective, what I think, for the success factor for the cloud computing, we need to have some sort of standard for the cloud service provider. Just like, our for the hotel, okay? Yep. We have classification on 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star. As far as we see, this is 5-star, we know what we expected from them. So I think, this is one way to, expand the cloud computing around the world.
Provide you a level of benchmarking of the different providers. Yeah.
Because cost it is also a major factor for cloud services. So how can we distinguish between different cloud service providers? A major issue.
Very important, yeah, for sure. Yeah, so there's no one type of cloud provider. There's different cloud providers for different categories in the market. Yeah. Tim?
What was the question? What was the question?
Okay. The question was, has anyone got a question for Tim? Oh, well, Tim's at a disadvantage because he's already told us everything he knows. Critical success factors.
Critical success factors. I'm going to answer a different question. But,
okay, you ask the question and we'll... Yeah.
Look, I think one thing I'd suggest to people is security people have to think about the kind of business or operation you're in. Like, if you're an e-commerce company, you're thinking about availability. You're thinking, everybody has to worry about brand and reputation, right? You have to think about compliance and operating in a world market. So I think, I'd urge people that are in that security space to think hard about the currency of the company you're in and what they value. You have to articulate it in the business case terms that they value and trust. A friend of mine used to work at, I better not say the company, but he said, one day the CEO, this is a major household name, everyone knows this company, and the CEO just was absolutely furious that when the hell was the last time you people had done some serious innovation? And he said, I want something on my desk. You got 3 weeks, or your job is history. So everybody scrambles, and one guy comes in with an iPhone app, and to make a long story short, the app had generated over $500 million worth of revenue in less than a year. Now, can you imagine the security guy saying, I need a few more weeks' time. I need a little more to do it. So there's true decision making that has to be involved about the risks involved and whether you want to take it. I think it also tells us that vendors are going to need to know how to localize content. They're going to have to, wherever your server is, some government, some entity is going to want to have some say about how you operate. If you serve Nazi memorabilia in Germany or France, someone's going to, I don't care where your server is, they're going to say something or want to do something. Law hasn't been repealed. There is, people talk about Cyberport, but there's a real world, real laws, real sovereignties involved with data and where you operate. So summary point is security people think about the kind of business you're in, what they value. Think about the environments and places that you're going to operate. That kind of drive a lot of the decision making you have to make.
It's interesting hearing Tim and Terry talking about the issue of internal, and it talks about cultural change as well, because for so long IT has been in-house in organisations and has been very much embedded and controlled within there. Sort of like going back to ATM machines and cash. Back when they first came in, the banks filled them up with cash, but they very quickly realised that that wasn't their core business. You can get someone that's a specialist in that area to fill up those machines. So, are there any questions from the audience? We've got a very diverse 270-degree view here. One down the back over there.
Yeah, I have a question for Tim. Because you're a scientist, in 5 to 10 years of time, what do you see the cost of computing, the business environment affected by the cloud computing? In terms of normal, citizen life, the cost they're buying, from the Walmart or things like that.
Well, the summary point is, look, that technology will create problems and solve problems at the very same time. Okay? I mean, the eternal issues of humanity, war, health, and these things will always be impacted us. But I think I think we should probably have a view that technology will fix certain things that will cause new ones to occur. I talked before about how gentleman was asking me about U.S. dominance in some of these fields, but I think yes, but I think there's also opportunity that arises from those things. But in terms of big broad currents, those four that I mentioned, right? I think at least in the short term, cloud, the emergence of analytics and big data and what we can do. Believe me, there's hype in every one of the things. One of the service levels I wanted to create was hype as a service, but it just never took off inside. So this idea of big data, social, being a different medium. I mean, you think about what Facebook accesses, like how much of the planet it can actually see. Now, of course, they're still going to be challenged by how to make money. How many ads can I look at? How many of these business models can be sustained by advertising and search? Somewhere, somebody has to have an idea beyond search. So I think that's another influence. And big data, social, mobile obviously is another one. Most of, obviously the use of mobile especially in the Asian sector world is a lot larger use of mobile. And in the emerging world, say in South America or Africa, much more use. So I think those will be very powerful influences going over the next several years. As I said, also, I think we'll emerge to more app-oriented kinds of things. Essentially, people want us to solve problems. They don't think about these big, massive issues of this. What's a good place to eat? What's the cheapest price for this thing? What are other people doing? It's a social, connected world, and I think these big influences will drive us forward. But I do think we're going to have different, ultimately better business models to sustain these things. And we're also looking at, we're depending on certain fundamental elements of infrastructure and, networking, to things like IPv6, naming, routing, and numbering, these eternal parts of, I don't know what we're going to do in 10 years, but I know we're still going to be using DNS, BGP, and IPv6, and these other things that somehow we have to drive some investment into these things. Remember, the definition I gave you on cloud is kind of an enterprise view of cloud. There is a web scale, an incredible size and scale where different rules apply at the Google, Amazon, Azure kind of way. I think we're going to see, again, a lot of collision of business models, which wins. Amazon's a low-cost provider, the only technology low-cost provider. Mm-hmm. Imagine people sitting around every day in your company saying, how can we drive the margins down? How winning a strategy is that, right? But they too will face they'll face pressures, right, as the eternal currents of economic activity occur. But I think those are the big four for right now. My worry is about investment in fundamental infrastructure things that we use to use these things, right? The internet, protocols that are, IPv6 we're just getting around to, it's 20-some years old, right? We don't have much security built into BGP, Border Gateway Protocol. There isn't any. There's very little in it. So my hope is, of course, that these powerful economic activity that occurs will help us drive investment in these core elements.
Great. Any other panelists want to add?
I'd just sort of add to that one of the big things that Facebook have done is started to outsource the designs for not just their data centers, but for their hardware. And I expect that one of the things we'll start to see is as a lot of the other cloud service providers drive that scale up, you'll start to see commodity hardware becoming more and more commonplace. Following those designs whereby actually we can swap out hardware, we can put very dense compute resource in place. And all of that is all well and very good. But to sort of expand on your point of the hyperscale web applications have been developed for that hyperscale to run on commodity grade hardware platforms, to run from huge data centers located all around the world. In the corporate world, people are only now just starting to think about it. It was really good today to see the guy at Next Media start talking about how they're driving out into the cloud. They're developing on Hadoop. They're using distribution. That's one of the first enterprise plays to deliver that. Many more organizations will have to step up. And we've talked about cost a lot. And some of the reality there is if we stay fixated on picking up our standard applications we're running in-house and moving them to a cloud service, does the cost really go down? Because the cost isn't in the operation of that device. And the security inherently is there in most of these things. And it's there in a lot of the cloud service providers. It's looking at how we redevelop those corporate applications. How do we drive the scale that the web guys have done into our businesses? And that's going to be a challenge.
Good. Okay. We all know why we're all here. It's because there's a lucky draw after the panel. That's why we're all here. But what we forgot to tell you is the lucky draw has already started. So for the person that asked the first question, congratulations, you're our first winner. Stand up, down the back. Yep. You get one of these lucky draw prizes. Oh, no, you've got to ask a question to get a prize.
First question is here.
Well, panelists don't count. Okay, so that's the bravery award, yeah? Okay, so do we have any more brave souls in the audience? Gee, all the hands are going up all of a sudden. Okay, second row.
Okay, to all panelists, what do you guys think about what status of cloud computing to be trustable by public? I'm not talking about the corporate company, but all users, public users, who will think about cloud is trustable as the way they buy Apple, iPhone, even they don't use the powerful features of iPhone or just die in or out. What do you think about, and how long does it take, or how long does it take for these status to be realized? Yeah, thank you.
Who's going to start with that one?
Well,
Charles?
I'll start a little bit. I don't know if I'm generalizing, but I might try to answer by saying that users, if you're talking about general public or public users, normal average users, they tend to think about these problems, trust and security, after the fact. After when something fails, and when suddenly you read in the newspaper, whoever. A big security incident or hole happened and so on, and then I'm very concerned. Do they throw away their iPhones after that? No, they don't. After a couple of days, they keep on using it. But corporates are very different. They have all these professionals and lawyers and all that and managers, and then they'll evaluate all these options and think about all the potential problems before they get into it. That's why we see some of the delays in implementation of private clouds, because there are too many things that too many people will get afraid of, and and end up staying with the status quo, which may or may not be better, but at least they're sticking to the old stuff or the status quo. So I tend to think that if you really are talking about the general public, actually they will continue to be the boldest in terms of trying to move things ahead and so on. Especially when we're talking about the cloud and even IPv6 that Tim mentioned, we're beginning to suspect that maybe the mobile users and with all these devices are going to be the real innovative force, the real innovators, because they're the ones who will be testing these new technologies and paradigms without knowing it. And with LTE supporting IPv6 and so on, they're just going to be using these technologies in some near point in the future without even knowing it.
Let me just, there's.
Yeah, of course, I knew you
I know
would.
many ancient Chinese proverbs, but to lead the people, you have to get behind them, and the people are at mobile and using it. And I think that's really the forefront of innovation these days is the mobile space.
And the big thing, whilst you asked about the consumer platforms, and I've done some work with some of the consumer-grade players in that space, one of the big things that's changed is changing in the local market. We're seeing a lot of the big organizations, particularly within North Asia, say, well, these guys with their handheld devices, they're driving this innovation. They're bringing these consumer platforms in, and all of a sudden they're becoming corporate. We're seeing mass migrations away from corporate issued devices to consumer and bring your own device. We're seeing huge influx of personal devices into the corporate space, and that has security concerns and security risks, and it causes us a new challenge. And it's, for all of us in the room, it's a paradigm shift from where we've always worked. We've had corporate issued devices, we've had our network, we've had this. Now all of a sudden we're not only faced with our organizations, our clients saying we want to move to the cloud, but then we've got this other army saying, and we want to bring our own devices to access these applications. We've gone through vast amounts of change as a business in the last 12 months. We've migrated services. We're allowing our users to use their own devices. And it's a complete mindset change.
Okay. Good. So, because, Terry.
For me, I would consider, that consumer market nowadays, you don't get much choice. You either use it or you dump it. But what I consider the future, the cloud computing, if we can have classification for service provider, so all the application or software service provider, they can pick, cloud service provider, pack their service on top of it, and so the security can be enhanced. And the at consumer level, they will be able to identify that platform is more secure than the others.
It's interesting. One of the presentations this morning introduced the concept of the bank, and you go to the bank and you trust the bank to hold your money and all that. The big difference between the bank and the cloud service provider thing is the whole banking financial is mandated, regulated by governments. The whole cloud space, there's no regulation at all, practically, by governments.
Sure.
And it's a big, you put $100 million in the bank, you've got an element of certainty that it's protected because of the government oversight. Cloud service provider, you've got none of that. So you need to do a lot more due diligence yourself as the organisation to become comfortable and happy. An example that came up the other day is a small organisation I know, very small. They outsourced their data centre basically. They said, put my computer servers in this little data centre. The other day they got a phone call. 2 weeks. We've gone out of business. You've got 2 weeks to do whatever you want with your servers and infrastructure. Now, all of a sudden, a decision that the organisation did not see coming has been dumped in our lap. That's part of the challenges that we've got in cloud computing and environment is how do you build up that trust that it's not going to happen to you? that the organisation is not going to go out of business. Or there's examples in the US and other places of the world where law enforcement comes in because a bad Apple, another player in there, just happens to be using the same virtual infrastructure you are, and yet law enforcement's not educated that it's a virtual environment, so they just take the whole boxes. Anyway, so that was another question. Anyone else want to add to that? Nick? Yeah?
Well, this is from a contractual perspective. You find that we're sort of... IT lawyers are so used to dealing with software licenses, and because software licenses have been around for so long, right, the industry has sort of developed standard things that you expect to see in a software license. And the experience I've had with cloud computing, with clients procuring cloud computing services, is that there's a lot less, it's not developed yet as to what the standard things you should see in a cloud computing contract are. And there's a lot of these questions around things like what happens if the cloud computing provider becomes insolvent, or what happens if there's even simpler, less dramatic than that. What happens if you're not happy with the quality of service, so you refuse to pay your bill? Can they hold on to your data until you pay your bill, like a mechanic would hold on to your car until you pay for the repairs? That's a pretty sort of simple example, but you know, in traditional software licensing, we have the concept of source code escrow, and you know, the industry is sort of used to that, and you can say to your client, well, if you're worried about the prospect of insolvency, how about this option of escrow? That I'm not aware of anyone offering escrow for cloud services yet, even if that's practicable for some services. But there's all these sort of things that are, you know, waiting to sort of sort themselves out in terms of what the industry and its customers sort of decide is going to be usual practice.
Good.
I think in terms of consumer market, I think most of the focus are focused on the end user side. Endpoint security is definitely a very important thing, and we see that mobile security is getting more and more attention from, no matter from the banking industry and also the utility company, because they are providing more services for the end user in mobility. So they would use more security mobile device, and at that point, I think in terms of cloud service provider, say for example, actually a recent incident that a storage cloud service provider is providing storage for consumer because of they have some upgrade, and one Sunday they release their service just for 5 minutes, and everybody can get access to different accounts. And this is a very key important incident that the social responsibilities on cloud service provider is getting increasingly important in that case.
Good. Okay, we have our first pigeon mail question. And this is a good one because it brings in regionality issues, which we haven't touched on here at the moment. Should Hong Kong, Asia Pacific develop our own regional security audit requirements or standards for cloud computing? As many of our cloud service providers are not based in Hong Kong or Macau. Do we still need regional security audit requirements? Is there something that we need that's unique to this part of the world, which we need to impose on providers that aren't actually based in Hong Kong? Tim?
Well, it's not my expertise, but I have an opinion nonetheless.
Your opinion's greatly valued.
It's, of course, I certainly have a certain bias towards standards, not surprisingly. But I would encourage people to think hard about world markets, and we need to far more harmonize our issues in compliance and audit in other spaces. There's always a need. I think everyone's going to have to learn how to localize some aspects of every product offering, right? But I'd encourage, please, to try to drive as much as possible to generally more uniform practices. And what we really need in cloud is learn how to protect data wherever it is, because it's our ability to really control where it is, how it is, and when we try to stand on this shifting sands of, by God, it's got to be here and only here.
Yep.
We far more need to know how to operate in global markets more uniformly, I think. That's true whether it's audit or security in several places.
Okay. Anyone else have a comment on that one?
Yeah.
Yep.
What I consider it is if we don't have, if we really need it nowadays, and in the world that we don't have all the practices, we might implement. I think looking at the history, just like the ISO 27001, it is evolved from the BS 77799, yeah, and also the Orange Book, all these standards. So I think ultimately, we will have a common standard for that.
Certainly
It depends on the time and the urgency of the requirement.
Certainly there's a lot more standards coming. I'm sure NIST is coming out with more. I know ISO's got 27017 under development and 27018 under development, a new Part 5 for 27036, which Tim mentioned earlier.
It sounds kind of scary. Do I have to read the first 27,000 or just 27,000?
Well, you do, because 27,000 is an overview on vocabulary, so which goes back to Charles's initial point, yeah? Okay, you want to say something, Lee?
Yeah, I mean, I guess our perspective of it is, I guess, pretty much somewhat well informed. As a global service provider, we get asked these issues frequently. We actually run a federal grade platform for the US government, following the NIST standards, and it's not without its challenges. I was saying to Tim earlier, there were some changes over the last couple of years to the Disability Act. The government have now got very good at enforcing those changes. We've had to go through and implement a lot of that into our platforms. It's not painless for us to keep up, but it allows us to adopt a lot of NIST guidelines as best practice for our enterprise-grade platforms around the world. We get asked about compliance and regulation around the region a lot, and have pretty much a full-time guy based in Hong Kong that looks into answering those questions for us. And every time they're different. And to your point earlier, how a lot of these standards aren't defined and the contracts aren't used to be going through yet. And we're finding, that we'll get better. Everybody will get better. But it's still not quite there yet.
Yeah. We're improving. Other questions we have? I'll go for the one over this side of the room, and then we'll come back to here. Front row.
Yeah, I'm just following on from the analogy to banks. So do you think there may be a need for regulations or certification before a company could be a cloud provider? And in particular, there were mentions about services wouldn't be based in Hong Kong. For example, a lot of the cloud services, the data center would be based in Singapore or other countries within the region. So, I mean, given that privacy data would be transmitted, and maybe Nick could answer whether regulations, especially in the region, should be created instead of just a local jurisdiction.
Yes, it would certainly be a good idea. It's still a patchwork of privacy regulations. So countries like, obviously the EU was the leader, and Hong Kong was not far behind, and then Australia eventually got around to it, and a handful of countries eventually were sort of felt threatened enough by the EU's threat not to share data across borders. They sort of started to introduce their own. The problem is that they're still not very uniform. There's still little differences. Most of them have followed the EU example, but the EU example, I guess the EU has a very different philosophical approach to a lot of regulatory issues, but to privacy, to a very different approach to the US, and a somewhat different approach to Australia and to Asia and other parts of the world. It would certainly be a very good idea for there to be more uniform privacy regulation between countries. Probably before that, there needs to be privacy regulation introduced in the countries that don't have it, for a start. But at the moment, the state of play with, just to take the example of transporter data flow, which was, I'm sure, discussed earlier today, at the moment, our clients who come to us and say we want to consolidate our data centre data centres in one or two locations. It's an exercise in going to almost every country and asking them what are the rules about transport of data flow. Will we be able to get our customers' data out of your country? And in the case of Hong Kong, currently the answer is very simple: go for your life. But in countries like in European countries and in Australia and in a lot of countries, the answer is not that simple. And it's slightly different everywhere, so you have to go and get legal advice everywhere, and of course that's a very expensive exercise. So what would be brilliant would be if there was some degree of uniformity between all these laws. At the moment there's not, and it's probably a long road until, I'm sure the UN's got other things to worry about than privacy, but it's certainly an area that is going to become increasingly important to look into.
Okay, Charles?
Yes, I think Nick was talking about privacy, but the question actually would cover somewhat a little bit broader, looking at a broader area, whether or not cloud service provider, for example, should be regulated. My take is that privacy is hard enough. And if we talk about something that we started out by saying that it's difficult to define, and you're trying to regulate that would be even harder. The closest that we have to cloud regulation might be, actually not quite close, is telecom. Bank, we talk about this difference, we talk about banks, but actually bank is not the same as, your money is not your data. You put some money in, you get back your money, in whichever denomination and so on, and even currency, all you need is some sort of exchange system. But data isn't something like that. It isn't that at all. Unlike money, you don't mind other people touching your money as long as you can get your money back, but you don't want other people touching your data and so on. And that's why you have all these issues. So, it's nice to compare with banks, but it's not quite the same. And if we talk about even telecom regulation. Telecom companies for a long time insist that they're carriers only, and I don't want to know or touch or be responsible for what's going through. And this is a huge paradigm shift when we're thinking about cloud right now, that all of a sudden you have to be responsible for what's in it, and you're not a carrier anymore, even though many of the big cloud companies or players tend to many of them do have some sort of telecom relationship, but it's a totally different business. And the final point I want to make is if cloud providers are even today, are being regulated, then you won't see any iCloud, and you won't see any Dropbox, and so on. Is that good or bad? Certainly, people wouldn't be, getting into troubles or losing the data and so on. But they don't even have these services to start with. Is it bad for innovation and creativity? That I think we also need to think about it and find a balance.
I would say that Europe is, in fact, I think, for its enormous, look, this is where I'd like to keep my personal data, is in Europe, right? But I think it has definitely impacted them economically. I think the more dangerous space actually is the mobile space, where violating your privacy is some of our business models that people have, right? And think about it when you get an app and maybe it wants access to your address book so it can serve some page or some information to you, and that seems like a very legitimate good thing, but its problem is when the other apps do it, right? And presently you have the permission models inside an Android or even iOS. These are kind of loose. There isn't a whole lot of testing of any of these stuff that goes on, right? Maybe to make sure you pay, but there isn't a lot, and so it's a lot more complicated than, well, those just people aren't doing it right. There's a lot of social issues involved here. If you want to do disease surveillance and medical information, some of the private impact researchers' ability to do that really well. So I think we need to have a much more complicated conversation about these things. And just another point on the mobile space, a lot of times there's a lot of things that happen. You gave them permission to do this, right? And and is it malware if you told them they could do that, right? Right? And there are some things the carrier wants to do in terms of managing it and monitoring it and giving you the service. But it also has other intimate, like the famous carrier IQ instance of what could they do. So we need a lot more sophisticated conversation on what are the social norms and what are the social goods, innovation has been, I would argue in Europe, has been seriously hit by some of this, right? And I don't think it's fair to layer that all on privacy, right? But that unwillingness to adapt and live with an uncertain future, I think, has hit them hard.
One of the other challenges I think is coming along, which I'll bring it back to privacy, for example, is the changing privacy landscape. For example, in Europe, what Nicholas is talking about, they're introducing this issue of right to forget, which means all the cloud service providers are going to have the ability to forget that data when it's requested by the organisation. Now, as their models got that level of fine-grained granularity built in to delete it, one record of all their backup tapes, for example. Anyway, time's running out.
Is that safer or more dangerous by having all those links?
Well, that's it's one of these things. It's very much evolving. Our time is up because everyone's in the audience asking a question. I wanted to get to you, but we've run out of time. But the question everyone's asking is, how many more questions are they going to ask? We want to get to the prize draw, yeah? So I'd like to thank the panellists, Charles, Edmund, Lee, Nicholas, Terry and Tim. Thank you very much. Now,
So would all the panelists stay for a group photo?
We're going to have a group photo.
Yeah, thank you.